In the dark of night, Jack was awakened by a sharp knock on the door. Before he could recover, he heard the door break open under the force of a blow, and two masked men stormed into the house. Mary, who had been sleeping in her room, woke up to the noise and quietly began to cry. Jack realized that something terrible was happening. He rushed to the door of the children's room to protect his daughter, but the attackers were faster. One of them hit him in the head with a heavy object. The world around him grew dim, and the voices became muffled, as if heard through water. Before he lost consciousness, Jack heard Mary's cries and a stranger's voice saying, "Take her, he won't survive anyway." When Jack regained consciousness, he found himself in a hospital, beaten but alive. A police officer sat next to him and explained that the neighbors had called an ambulance when they saw the broken door and signs of a struggle. Mary was nowhere to be found, and the police suspected that the attackers might have taken her. Months of searching yielded no results. Later, Jack was informed that Mary had been found and placed in an orphanage, as he was believed to be dead. However, due to legal issues and Jack's condition, he still had to prove that he was alive in order to regain custody of his daughter. This marked the beginning of his battle for himself, for the truth, and for his little Mary. After being discharged from the hospital, Jack began his desperate search for Mary. He visited orphanages, checked lists of children, and spoke with volunteers and social workers. His only goal was to see his daughter again. One day, he received a phone call. There was a girl in an orphanage on the outskirts of the city who resembled Mary. Jack dropped everything and rushed there immediately. When he saw the child, his heart tightened. The little girl playing in the yard looked very much like his daughter, the same light hair, big brown eyes, and a barely noticeable mole on her cheek. Jack approached the caregiver, barely containing his emotions, and asked about the girl. "Her name is Liana," explained the woman. "She has been here since birth. Her parents were never found." Jack insisted on a DNA test. The wait for the results was unbearable, but a few days later, he was told that this was not Mary. His world shattered again. Despite this, Jack didn't give up. He decided to continue searching, reviewing surveillance footage, questioning witnesses, and even hiring private investigators. He wouldn't allow himself to stop, because he believed Mary was out there, and he would find her. Each time he saw a child who even slightly resembled Mary, his heart filled with new hope. Years passed, and Jack gradually came to terms with the idea that he might never see Mary again. However, he always carried a photo of her in his wallet, a little girl in a pink dress with a bright smile. It was his only reminder of the happy time when they were together. To fill the emptiness, Jack threw himself into work. He started a small business that gradually grew into a large company. His determination and tireless work brought him success, and Jack became a well-known businessman in his city. But even at the peak of success, he remained a man with a deep wound inside. He often looked at Mary's photo and wondered what she might have become. Did she love to draw? Did she read books before bed? Did she remember him at all? Jack spent large sums on charity, especially supporting orphanages and programs for children. Perhaps it was his way of helping other children, as he had wanted to help his Mary. He achieved everything one could wish for in life: money, status, recognition. But in his heart, there always remained an empty space that could only be filled by his daughter. And even though most of his soul had given up, he always believed in the tiny chance that one day, Mary would return to his life. Mary was already 10 years old when she decided to run away from the orphanage. Her life there had become a constant struggle. Other children often bullied her, took her food, and mocked her, saying no one would ever take her home. The caregivers were indifferent and sometimes even cruel. One day, after an especially difficult day when she had been insulted again, Mary decided she could no longer stay in that place. At night, while everyone was asleep, she quietly gathered her things: a small backpack with an old doll, a book once given to her by a kind volunteer, and a warm sweater. She crawled through a hole in the fence she had noticed long ago and ran away. The streets were terrifying for Mary, but she felt free. She walked without a clear plan, but she knew one thing: she had to get as far away from the orphanage as possible. At first, she hid in parks and abandoned buildings, asking passers-by for food and doing small jobs in exchange for meals. Despite the hardships, Mary held on. She believed that one day she would find her home and family. In her heart, there was still hope that her father, whom she barely remembered, was still searching for her. But for now, she had to survive on her own, facing hardships and fighting for her place in this large, indifferent world. Mary quickly learned that life on the streets was a constant battle. She begged near supermarkets and cafes, trying to look as unpathetic as possible so as not to scare people away. Sometimes, people threw her a few coins, but more often, they turned away or chased her off. Hunger was her greatest enemy. There were days when she ate nothing. Mary learned to scavenge for food in dumpsters near restaurants, taking leftovers before they were thrown away. But even here, danger followed her. Once, she was spotted and threatened with police. Another challenge was the weather. In the summer, the sun burned her skin, and in winter, the cold pierced to her bones. Mary slept on park benches and sometimes hid in abandoned buildings to escape rain or snow. The hardest part was at night, when fear and loneliness overwhelmed her, making her cry softly so as not to attract the attention of strangers. Once, a group of teenagers who also lived on the streets tried to steal her backpack. She fought desperately to protect the only thing she had, but she was hit several times and left empty-handed. But Mary didn't break. She found an old blanket in the trash, made a cloak out of it, and continued to live. Eventually, she learned to sing simple songs on the street to attract the attention of passers-by. People were more willing to throw money, and she was able to buy bread and water from time to time. But the dangers didn't disappear. Once, Mary encountered a man who promised to help her, but he turned out to be someone completely different than he had appeared. Luckily, she managed to escape. Life on the street made her strong and tough, but it left marks on her soul. Despite everything, Mary continued to fight, for deep in her heart, there remained a hope that one day her life would change. One gloomy autumn day, Mary was sitting by the bus stop, wrapped in her old blanket. She was singing a quiet song, hoping that someone would leave a few coins for her. People hurried past without even looking her way. Suddenly, a middle-aged woman with warm, kind eyes stopped beside her. She leaned down to Mary and asked, "What's your name, sweetie?" Mary looked up and cautiously replied, "Mary, what are you doing here alone?" The stranger continued. At first, the girl was silent, but something in the woman's gaze made her feel trust. She began to tell her story about the orphanage, the escape, hunger, and cold nights. The woman listened carefully, without interrupting. "My name is Aunt Margaret," she said when Mary finished. "You're very brave, but you won't be alone anymore. You're coming with me." Mary looked at her with suspicion. Her experience had taught her not to trust people, but something in Margaret's gentle voice made her agree. The woman took Mary to her cozy home. It was a small house with a warm fireplace and the smell of freshly baked bread. Margaret gave the girl hot tea and new clothes. "From now on, you'll live here," she said with a smile. Mary couldn't believe her happiness. For the first time in many years, she felt safe. Over time, she told Margaret everything she remembered about her father, and the woman promised to help her find him. For Mary, this was the beginning of a new life, one filled with warmth, care, and hope again. The first days in the new home felt like a real miracle for Mary. She started getting used to the warmth surrounding her and to the kindness of Aunt Margaret, who treated her like her own daughter. But the thing that worried Mary the most was that she had to start going to a new school. In the morning, Aunt Margaret made her breakfast and helped her pick out clothes. Mary carefully put on the new school uniform that Margaret had bought for her and looked in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. The girl who looked so stylish and neat seemed completely different from the one who, just a few weeks ago, wandered in dirty, old rags. "You look great, Mary," Margaret said with a smile. "Are you ready for school?" Mary nodded, though inside she felt anxious. She was afraid that the new kids would laugh at her or, even worse, be wary because of her past. She didn't know how she would fit into the new environment, since she had been alone not long ago, and now she had to become part of a group. When they arrived at the school, Mary felt a nervous flutter in her chest. It was a large building with spacious classrooms and modern equipment, nothing like what she had seen in the orphanage. Aunt Margaret took her to the principal's office, and then Mary entered the class. The first few lessons were tough. The children stared at her with curiosity, and Mary felt their eyes on her. But soon, things began to change. One of the girls, Anya, came up to her during recess and asked, "Are you new? I think we can be friends." It was so unexpected that Mary could barely believe her ears. For the first time, someone approached her with kindness, without fear or mockery. They started talking, and Anya showed her around the schoolyard, introducing her to other kids who turned out to be very friendly. Despite her initial anxiety, Mary began to feel much better. She gradually adapted, made new friends, and even started enjoying the lessons. The teachers were kind and supportive, helping her cope with what she had missed because of her difficult childhood. Each day, Mary felt more confident. She realized that school was not just a place for learning, but also for making new connections, for support and development. And though sometimes she missed Aunt Margaret, she knew that a new chapter was beginning in her life, one where she had the chance to be happy, not just survive. After several years of continuous work, Jack realized that his business was no longer bringing the success he desired. The first signs of a crisis had appeared a year ago, when investors began to pull back their funding and competitors, who hadn't been a threat before, started taking his clients. Jack tried to hold on, investing the last of his money, but eventually, the company sank. Frequently waking up in the middle of the night with thoughts of bankruptcy, Jack felt the weight of this failure on his shoulders. His old lifestyle, built around business deals and meetings, suddenly became too difficult and foreign. Everything he had achieved was falling apart, and now he faced a choice: to start over or change his path. One morning, after another tough day when he had to sign documents confirming the collapse of his business, Jack sat in his empty office, looking at the wall, where several certificates and awards used to hang. He felt a sharp pain, realizing that he no longer had that confidence. At one point, he thought that perhaps it was time to change everything. His gaze stopped on a job advertisement in a local school, which he had seen in the newspaper. A physics teacher, of course. Jack didn't have an education in this field, but his experience in business, especially in managing teams and organizing, could be useful. Moreover, he felt that working with children, who hadn't yet experienced the harshness of the adult world, might be exactly what he needed right now. Jack didn't think for long. He sent his resume, and a few days later, he was invited for an interview. He was hired as a teacher, and although he knew it would be hard, he was ready to try. At first, it wasn't easy for him to adapt. The class was full of energetic kids who didn't always take him seriously, and he felt somewhat out of place. However, over time, Jack found his role. He started telling the children stories about his business failures and successes, not hiding his mistakes. They appreciated his honesty and began to respect him for his experience, even though he was no longer the successful businessman he once was. This change in life was difficult, but it was in school that Jack felt that his life had real meaning. Here, he was an important part of something bigger than just money or recognition. He could pass on his knowledge and skills to new generations, and with each passing day, his heart filled with a new sense of purpose. A few months after Jack started working at the school, he finally adjusted to his new role as a teacher. He became more confident in his lessons, found common ground with the children, and even began offering advice to senior classes to help them figure out their future careers. At school, he felt not just like a teacher but a mentor, and that gave him a sense of satisfaction. But one morning, he received news that changed everything. His colleague, the physics teacher who taught the senior classes, unexpectedly left the school due to family reasons and moved to another city. The school principal asked Jack to temporarily take over her subject, as he had already been trusted to work with students. And to avoid disrupting the educational process, it was decided that Jack would teach physics. He was worried, because although he had some knowledge of the subject, he was not a specialist. However, after a while, he adapted and started preparing physics lessons. For him, this was another challenge he was ready to take on. Meanwhile, Mary, who had already become a high school student, also began to feel more confident in the new school. Her life became stable after Aunt Margaret took her in. She was getting good grades and quickly earned the trust of her classmates. Although at times she still felt sadness from being away from her family. However, she was always attentive in physics class. It was her favorite subject, and she happily shared her knowledge with others. Then one day, when Jack began teaching his first physics lesson to the seniors, he saw a girl in the class who struck him as familiar. It was Mary. She was sitting in the front row, listening attentively as he explained the complex formulas. Jack looked at her, and again he felt a strange sensation. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of someone from his past, but he couldn't quite recall who. Mary didn't react to him in any way. She was focused on the lesson, and her gaze was the same as the rest of the students. After a few days of shared lessons, Jack started noticing how Mary tried to avoid unnecessary contact with him, but at the same time, she treated him with respect. At first, he didn't pay much attention to this, but his heart felt some undefined connection. Over time, he started noticing details, her resemblance to the little girl he had once lost, her facial features, gestures. However, neither Jack nor Mary could remember what connected them. Jack didn't recognize her as his daughter, and Mary couldn't recall her father. She didn't know that the man before her was the very one who had been searching for her all these years. They were both blind to this connection because each had gone through so much pain and change in their lives that even the slightest hint of the truth seemed unreal. Months passed, and although some understanding developed between them, neither of them suspected that they could be closer than it appeared at first glance. One day, as usual, during the break, Mary stood in line at the school cafeteria. She was trying to pick something light so she wouldn't feel hungry until the end of the day. When it was her turn at the register, she took out her last few coins, just enough to cover the cost of her meal. But as soon as the cashier added up the total, Mary realized she was short by a few dollars. "Sorry, but this isn't enough," said the cashier, frowning. Mary lowered her head, trying not to cry. She began rummaging through her bag, hoping to find a few more coins, but it didn't help. At that moment, Jack, who was standing nearby, overheard the conversation and took notice. "How much are you short?" he asked. Mary looked up in surprise. She recognized him. It was her physics teacher, Jack. A feeling of awkwardness overwhelmed her, but she couldn't run away. "I'm short a few dollars," she said quietly. Without hesitation, Jack took a few bills from his wallet and placed them on the cashier's counter. "Here, this will cover your lunch," he said, looking at her. Mary looked at him with gratitude and, slightly embarrassed, took her food. She didn't know what to say. The feeling was strange because this man, who had seemed just like a teacher to her before, now felt like something more. When Jack left, and Mary sat down at the table, she noticed one detail. In the center of his wallet was a photograph, old and slightly faded, but entirely recognizable. It was a photo of her, from the time when she was little. Mary held her breath. She quickly pulled out her phone and looked at the photo she kept. It was her own photograph, taken in the orphanage, when she was still very young. Now everything fell into place. She felt her heart skip a few beats. Mary quickly left the cafeteria and went to the teacher's office. Jack was standing near his classroom, and when she approached, her voice trembled with emotion. "Why you? Is it you?" she asked, holding up the photo. Jack turned to her, and his eyes filled with astonishment. He looked at her photo, and there was a brief pause in his gaze, as though he was trying to comprehend what had just happened. You're my daughter?" he said, barely managing the words, feeling his heart begin to race. Mary couldn't stop the tears that streamed down her face. All these years, she had been searching for him, and now, after everything, she had finally found him again. Jack stepped toward her and gently embraced her, as though he had realized that he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "I've been searching for you for so long," he said, holding her tightly, "and now, finally, you're home." At that moment, both of them understood that all the struggles and separations had only been part of their journey. Now, when they were together again, everything else didn't matter. They were family, and their story was just beginning.